on this Monday night.
It was very frank. There was nothing held back on this.
Canadian lawmakers push their Chinese hosts for action, and the case is on the agenda when Trudeau talks to Trump.
It has been politicized beyond belief.
Canada's famous food guide is changing, but who's getting a say? Why nutrition has always come with a big serving of politics.
I'm not leaving my room until I see UNHCR. I want asylum.
And a young Saudi woman's great escape, at least for now. The power of social media in real life. This is The National. Criticized by some for not putting it on the official agenda, a Canadian delegation visiting Shanghai, China, has raised the cases of 2 detained Canadians. And they're hoping the message gets to Beijing that Canada wants former diplomat Michael Kovrig and entrepreneur Michael Spavor released immediately. The Prime Minister's office says Justin Trudeau spoke to U.S. President Donald Trump today, thanking him for the strong statements of support related to the detentions. There are questions, though, about whether the external pressure will have any real impact. The CBC's Sasha Petrusik is in Shanghai. Sasha?
Adrian, the parliamentarians here, the Canadians, say they're getting a polite enough welcome, but not everyone's agreeing with them, and not everyone even wants to be seen with them.
Even as the Canadian delegation was arriving to talk to NGO groups today, organizers were trying to prevent us from shooting the meeting. The MPs and senator had just left the Shanghai People's Congress, where the issue at the center of the dispute between Canada and China had come to a head.
Sorry.
Why don't you want me to take pictures of them?
The parliamentarians argued the case for the 2 imprisoned Canadians.
The gist of the message is that the executive branch of Canada has asked for their immediate release. We told them that in any international standard is not fair.
Chinese officials confronted the group about the detention of Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei executive arrested in Vancouver at Washington's request. The tone today, they say, was tough.
Did you get a sense that there was any possibility, was there any opening for progress in the case?
Whoever knows on these things, I think the fact that we had an open and frank discussion, and it was very frank. There was nothing held back on this. I think anytime you do that, that creates opportunities.
Over the next few days, the delegation will tour high-tech parks and other opportunities for more trade and exchange between Canada and China. But it may not amount to much with this big cloud hanging over the relationship, says Conservative MP Michael Cooper.
That until these issues are resolved, there really is not that much to talk about. Yeah, we have an important relationship with China. It's multifaceted, but at the end of the day, the elephant in the room is the fact that we have 2 Canadians here who have been arbitrarily detained.
So, Sasha, what do we know about how Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor are actually faring right now?
Well, as you can imagine, Adrian, it's difficult to get reliable information. The secrecy in China is pretty much complete, but a few details have trickled out. We have learned that they're being interrogated pretty much every day by China's security services. They're being kept in rooms or cells that are lit with bright lights 24 hours a day, and they have not been able to see either their families or a lawyer. They've seen the ambassador to China, Canada's ambassador, once, and they've been told that's not going to happen very often. So we can't verify much of this, but it is consistent with how China treats people it considers subversive.
Legally, though, Sasha, what's the status of the case against them?
That's a very good question. China's top prosecutor recently said that he thinks the case against them is very, very strong, but there have been no charges, and as far as we know, no legal action has actually started. So right now, they're in a legal limbo, although a very uncomfortable one.
Okay, Sasha Petrusik in Shanghai, thanks very much.
My pleasure.
Meanwhile, there's a setback for friends and family of one of the detained Canadians. A GoFundMe campaign for Michael Spavor has been shut down.
We were hoping to build a little pot of money that would help him resettle himself.
More than $15,000 was raised in a matter of days over the holidays, but this weekend the page went down. All the donations refunded. The website telling CBC News this was a decision made by our third-party payment processor, who are unable to process the funds. Part of Spavar's work in China was arranging trips to North Korea for tourists, including, most famously, for NBA star Dennis Rodman. Now, the thing is, North Korea is subject to a number of international sanctions over its nuclear weapons program, and virtually all Western banks refuse to allow transactions related to the Hermit Kingdom.
In this case, even though it wasn't connected to North Korea, it's likely that the payment processor just didn't want to take any chances. Just because Michael has worked with North Korea, and that's unfortunate.
Organizers say they hope to launch another fundraiser, though above all, exactly 4 weeks after Spavar has been detained, they're hoping he'll be released.
1 week into a new year, and those resolutions to eat better are probably being tested coast to coast. Health Canada's food guide gives advice on how to do it right, but it is changing with the help of 26,000 people and counting. That's how many the government's consulted over the last 3 years to give that guide a complete overhaul. But why so much talking about what is supposed to be a simple guide to healthy eating? Because as Kelly Crow shows us, at its heart, the food guide is political.
The original purpose of Canada's food guide was to fatten up soldiers to fight in World War II.
A man in the army is as good as the food he eats.
The Canada Food Guide has been updated 7 times since then, provoking furious backroom lobbying by food producers, each competing for a prominent place on the food guide rainbow.
In fact, the first industry influence was the milk industry calling for higher servings of milk.
In 1993, Health Canada increased the recommended servings of meat and dairy in response to industry pressure.
The outcry was enough to make one think that the 4 food groups should be renamed the 4 lobby groups.
All of that backroom lobbying has hurt the food guide's credibility, according to Health Canada's own research. There remains a perception that food industry representatives exerted influence on the development of the recommendations in the food guide. So Health Canada has made a point of being more transparent as it updates the document for the first time in 12 years. This time, officials drafting the new food guide will not be meeting with representatives from the food and beverage industry.
It should be a science health document, and it has been politicized beyond belief because there's a lot at stake.
Anti-poverty activist Nick Saul participated in the online consultations, and he's still concerned about industry influence.
We have a food system that is very focused on sales and profits, and the food that is often produced through that food system is not good for our health.
When it finally comes out, Canadians might not recognize the new food guide. Test concepts being circulated reveal that the familiar 4 food groups are gone. Instead, there will be a general guide to get protein from various sources, especially plants, and to eat lots of fruits and vegetables and whole grains. And the food guide will also offer some behavior tips. Eat with others, enjoy your food, and cook more. But many Canadians don't have the time or the budget to prepare healthy meals regardless of the food guide's advice.
The people who really that the food guide's really aimed at are people who are already struggling to just make ends meet. And so the importance placed on the food guide is perhaps misplaced.
When will Canadians get to see the new food guide? There's no firm date set, but Health Canada says it will be unveiled sometime in the next few months. Kelly Crow, CBC News, Toronto.
Another group with a lot on the line is the fruit juice industry. Later in the program, we're going to look at their fight to keep their place in the guide. Plus, what are they fighting over anyway? We'll ask everyday Canadians if they even read the food guide at all.
In northern BC today, the RCMP closed in on a blockade set up by Indigenous elders who say they'll block construction of a natural gas pipeline. But the Mounties are enforcing a court order that says the pipeline company has the right to build on that land. They have made about 11 arrests. The CBC's Chantal Bell-Richard was on the scene when things heated up.
The RCMP have come in as anticipated, and they've just broken down the gate that was set up to prevent people from accessing the bridge here, and there were a couple, there was definitely yelling and screaming at the RCMP, and the RCMP have said that a couple of people here are under arrest already in violation of the injunction. Right behind me on the other side of this bridge that goes down this road, there is a giant fire burning. There's an RCMP helicopter that's flying overhead, and someone just a couple of moments ago fell a tree that also is covering the road even further back. So lots of activity happening here right now. And
at stake is a 670-kilometer pipeline being built by Coastal GasLink. It will bring gas that has been fracked from Dawson Creek westward to Kitimat and LNG Canada's $40 billion processing plant. But here's the problem. 190 kilometers of that pipeline will run through Wet'suwet'en territory. The CBC's Renee Filipponi is in the region tonight. She has more on today's clash and its complex backstory.
Late this morning, RCMP arrived, as expected, to this camp on a remote logging road on Wet'suwet'en traditional territory. They were there to enforce a court injunction, shut down the camp, and open this blockade.
We haven't let anybody come through. We've only let people go out.
People trying to get to the camp were stopped by police 20 kilometers out as RCMP helicopters flew overhead. The tensions are high with so many questions in the air. These 4 hereditary chiefs have been fighting to protect this land for years.
We live off the land, we live off the water, and we pick berries, we pick plants. So those are very important things to us, and especially the Wet'suwet'en is where all the salmon go to spawn.
The Wet'suwet'en First Nation has never signed a treaty, and according to the landmark 1997 Delgamuukw Supreme Court case, that means they haven't extinguished their rights to this land. So according to the people here, they should have a say in what happens to it.
And sometimes there's misunderstanding and lack of respect.
Local MP Nathan Cullen was here today urging for a peaceful resolution.
And here we have 2 political systems engaging with each other, the traditional system and Canada's, and it's a bit messy sometimes.
TransCanada, the company behind the pipeline, says 20 First Nations band councils support the project and have spoken about how the economic benefits from this project could provide a better future for their people. But the hereditary chiefs here disagree, and it's created tension within the nation. They say the elected band councils only have authority over what happens on reserve and not over the thousands of square kilometers on Wet'suwet'en traditional territory.
There is no price tag on our territory, never. It's been passed down from one generation to another, and the land replenishes itself every year.
For now, police aren't giving any information about their plans as the tensions remain hot on a very cold night. Renee Filipponi, CBC News, near Houston, BC.
Rahaf Mohammed Al-Qanoun tonight is far from home, on the run, and afraid for her life. The 18-year-old Saudi woman has renounced Islam. She says her family abused her, and so she tried to flee and escape to Australia. She made it as far as Thailand, but that's where the harsh realities of her homeland caught up with her. This is the look of relief. Rahaf Al-Qanoun finally leaving the Bangkok airport today under the protection of the UNHCR. Hours earlier, she'd been trapped and terrified. On the run from oppression and her Saudi family, Al-Qanoun landed at the Bangkok airport en route to Australia. But Saudi diplomats were waiting and took her passport, warned she was about to be deported. She barricaded herself in a hotel room, afraid deportation meant death. Outside her door, security officials saying they just wanted a word.
I want asylum.
Panicked, she began tweeting. Back in Montreal, journalist and activist Mona El Hataway started translating the tweets.
And she was sending me text messages, really heart-wrenching text messages saying, "Mona, I'm terribly scared. I swear if they take me back, I'll be killed on arrival." And her friend was sending me similar messages.
An army of human rights activists leapt to action, alerting embassies, the UN, foreign ministers, shouting her story to the world because they know the fears are real. April 2017, another Saudi, 24-year-old Dina Ali Lassoum, was trying to escape her family and get to Australia.
If my family come, they will kill me. If I go back to Saudi Arabia, I will be dead. Please help me.
Transiting in Manila, she panicked when she saw her uncles appear. She asked a Canadian tourist for help. The woman took these photos and recorded this video. Help didn't come. Ali Lasloum was last seen being carried onto a plane, her mouth taped, arms and legs bound. She hasn't been heard from since.
What do you want?
No, just want to say hi to you.
Al Qanun wrote last night she got scared when her father showed up at the airport, but then a turn. A tweet from the UN High Commission for Refugees. My colleagues are at the airport now. Thai authorities agreed to let her leave the airport with UN officials. The Saudis aren't pleased, and this is not over, but thanks to Al Qanun's quick thinking and some global generosity, countries around the world, including Canada, are now discussing where she should end up.
I want asylum.
We reached out to the Foreign Affairs Minister's office about Al Qanun's case. Chrystia Freeland's office told us Canada is very concerned by and watching closely the situation of Ms. Rahaf Al Qanun. Canada will always stand up for human rights, very much including women's rights. Now, Saudi Arabia got a lot of positive press last year when it allowed women to drive. Indeed, in recent years, the kingdom has started to relax its so-called guardianship laws. What's sometimes missed is how restrictive those laws continue to be. For example, women need a male relative's permission to get a passport, to leave town, to go to school, to work outside the home, or to marry. A woman who fails to obey her guardian is subject to arrest, and she can be held without charge indefinitely until her guardian comes to claim her.
Here are some of the other stories we're watching tonight. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is in China today. This visit comes just days after Kim warned he may look for alternative paths if the U.S. doesn't ease sanctions on his country. China is one of North Korea's most important economic and political allies. This visit will likely lead to a fourth summit with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. Operations at a mine that was the site of one of the biggest environmental disasters in BC's history are being suspended. In August 2014, a dam collapse at the Mount Poly mine sent 24 million cubic meters of waste and sludge into nearby waterways. The owner, Vancouver-based Imperial Metals, says it's suspending operations because of declining copper prices. And this piece of equipment traveling through Alberta is getting a lot of attention. It is as big as a football field and weighs 800,000 kilograms. It's called a splitter and is used to separate propylene from propane. It's headed to the Heartland Petrochemical Complex near Fort Saskatchewan.
And still ahead on The National, the government of Saskatchewan apologizes for its role in the 60s scoop. Why that apology was controversial even for survivors.
Plus a dangerous drug cocktail, how commonly prescribed pills are wreaking havoc in the shadow of the opioid crisis.
And the identity behind one of Montreal's most famous mystery philanthropists revealed upon his death. How his acts of kindness are being remembered in our moment.
Well, I'm trying to put the pieces together, and I'm wondering, whether in his childhood he had a longing for a bicycle, whether it gave him pleasure to think about these young kids being able to get exercise and mobility. I think it was a beautiful gesture.
This is ice cream, this is frozen dessert. This is juice, this is not juice. It's not me saying this, this is the law. There are literally thousands of legal definitions for foods, what you can call them and what you can't. There are three main reasons why food laws are important: harmonization for trade, standardization, and clarity for consumers. Here's what you need to know. If it's called ice cream, it's made with butterfat. Take that and replace it with palm oil, which is cheaper, and what you've got is frozen dessert. Chocolate must be made with cocoa butter. Something cheaper like wax or oil, and what you've got may be chocolate-y. But it's not chocolate. Juice is made of fruit. Though legally, it also contains sugar, preservatives, and sometimes flavor. If the label says drink, it only has to have 25% juice to make the cut. If it says cocktail, beverage, or punch, probably even less. Chicken breast, that's just chicken breast, right? If it says seasoned chicken breast, it has to contain chicken breast, but it can also contain binders, fillers, starches, and even soy. Most of the food laws are really specific, but some of them are weirdly loose. Legally, Canada just doesn't care about peanut butter. In the United States, it has to be at least 90% peanuts to get the name. Here at home, companies don't even have to disclose the peanut percentage, which is kind of nuts. But then there's jam. In Canada, you can't even call it jam if there's apple or rhubarb in it. Does that mean there's no such thing as rhubarb jam? Somebody better tell Grandma. We're also very specific about ketchup. Ketchup can contain tomatoes, vinegar, salt, sugar, seasonings, preservatives, and colors, and nothing else. So you could put some onion powder in there because it's a seasoning, but you try to put some real onions in your ketchup, and what you've got there is a ketchup-style condiment. Sometimes when a food law is really specific, it can cause problems. I'm referring, of course, to the Jamaican beef patty wars of the 1980s. Under the law, a patty is a really specific thing. A Jamaican beef patty doesn't fit the definition. So the Jamaican community took the government to court. They went to food court.
More than 9,000 Canadians have died of opioid-related overdoses since 2016. The focus has largely and understandably been on fentanyl. But now concerns are being raised about what can happen when opioids are combined with certain other drugs. Benzodiazepines are commonly used to treat anxiety and insomnia. But in places like Nova Scotia, they're also part of a disturbing trend. Richard Cuthbertson has this CBC News investigation.
This is my secret stash of the ones when he's little.
In her bungalow on the outskirts of Amherst, Nova Scotia, Wendy Golden keeps the photos of her son, 20-year-old Cody, stored away. They're just too painful to remain on the walls.
He was fun, he was loyal, he was honest.
On June 24th, 2014, she found Cody unconscious on the couch.
The ambulance arrived and tried everything they could to bring him back, but there was nothing that they could do.
Cody died after taking the opioid methadone and a benzodiazepine called clonazepam. Both had been given to him by a co-worker at the New Brunswick fish plant where they worked. Benzodiazepines have been around for 6 decades. The brand names, such as Valium and Ativan, are ubiquitous. But, like opioids, they can slow down breathing, and that can be lethal.
This is where people who fall under our care begin their journey.
Dr. Matthew Bowes is Chief Medical Officer for Nova Scotia.
Well, there's really good evidence that if you give benzodiazepines together with opioids, you increase the risk of death by intoxication.
Since 2011, there have been more than 440 opioid-related fatalities in Nova Scotia. In more than half those cases, a benzodiazepine contributed to the death.
The reasons are complicated. In some cases, people with opioid addictions have mental health issues, they're self-medicating. Others who are on the sedatives are prescribed an opioid to deal with an injury. But there's another concern. People are reaching out for benzodiazepines to deal with opioid withdrawal.
And sometimes, according to addiction specialist Dr. Dave Martel, they're getting them from doctors.
I think therein lies the danger, in that they're out in the community and being combined at times with opioids that can produce this kind of overdose.
Nova Scotia is now trying to keep better track of benzodiazepines. In October, it added the class of drugs to its prescription monitoring program. Richard Cuthbertson, CBC News, Amherst, Nova Scotia.
We don't have numbers for every province, but we do know the problem isn't found in Nova Scotia alone. Our research found that benzodiazepines contributed to well over half of opioid-related deaths in New Brunswick and more than 40% in Manitoba. The most recent available data appears to show that it's less prevalent elsewhere, including in Alberta.
Next on The National, a prescription for what you ought to eat. Health Canada is preparing its brand new food guide, and we're going to take you in depth. First, with how we think of juice. The guide has long considered it a way for us to get our daily fruits and vegetables, but that's involved a fierce fight behind the scenes. David Common will show us why. And after all this talk and time and money, do Canadians even follow the food guide? Nick Purdon hits the streets to find out.
Do you know what that is?
Yeah.
Do you follow it?
No.
The Canada Food Guide, is that something that you follow?
No.
Have you ever?
No.
Never?
No. I've seen it, but I've never paid any attention to it.
You have tickets for the late show?
Yeah.
How did you get the tickets?
My grandfather.
Your grandmother approve of the Beatles?
Yeah, she's a real good egg. I think they're grand. Marvelous, marvelous, marvelous.
Why do you say that, girl?
Oh, yeah, nice, clean boys. They're decent, clean boys. Anything you want them in this country. Look at the graduates falling up.
Which is your favorite, sweetheart? Starting with you.
Paul McCartney.
You want to marry Paul when you grow up?
Yeah.
You would like to marry Paul, would
Yes,
you?
sir.
You think there's any chance of that?
No. Yeah.
How about you, dear?
Ringo Starr.
Why is he your favorite?
The doll.
All right, well, how about you, sweetheart? Who's your favorite?
Paul.
Why?
Because he's cute.
How about you, sweetheart? Who's your favorite?
George.
All right, what happens to you girls when you see the Beatles?
Nothing. We get all hairy.
You just go hairy. You're hairy already. Do you have any boyfriends, kid?
Yeah, they don't like this either.
Boyfriends don't like the Beatles?
Right. No.
And why don't your boyfriends like the Beatles?
They're jealous.
I don't like the Beatles.
You get somebody like Peter, Paul, and Mary, now they have style.
I hate the Beatles.
No, they are folk singers.
There's nothing to the
thing
Beatles.
they sing is just, there's nothing to it.
Beatles are bad news. Do you expect this affection for the Beatles to last forever, dear?
No, for another 6 months. Yeah.
No, no.
At least. At least, yeah.
And then, are you going to find somebody else
No,
afterwards, dear?
no. We'll always be true fans.
Oh. Bless you. Can you give me your name, sir?
Yes, Jack Posland.
And are you a Beatle fan, Mr. Posland?
I like the Beatles, yes.
Who's your favorite Beatle, Mr. Posland?
Well, I like them all. I guess there's, I think Paul and Ringo, I guess, are my favorites.
Have you modeled your haircut on that of Ringo Starr?
No,
I don't know. I just grew it and did it the best way I knew how.
Do you feel that you resemble Ringo Starr?
Well, a lot of people seem to think I do.
Do what?
Resemble Ringo a little bit.
How old are you?
I'm 26.
26 years old, eh? And you're still a Beatle fan?
Well, I like them.
One of the Beatles is your favorite.
Paul.
What happens to you when you see Paul?
I don't know, I go nuts, I guess.
All right. What about you? You, John, your favorite?
Yes.
Why?
I don't know. He just appeals to me.
Goes to your house, sweetheart.
I don't know. I think he's good looking.
I think he's good looking. What about you, dear?
Oh, I love George.
Why?
Oh, he's just fabulous. I really love him.
There has been objection to the kind of example you're setting by smoking in public. Have you ever considered giving it up?
No. Why should we? No.
Because we don't set examples.
Everybody else smokes in front of everybody else, you know.
And we don't set examples to people, you see.
Then why should we, you know? We even drink.
All right, can you girls tell me how much trouble have you gone to see the Beatles here in Toronto?
Sandy?
Yeah.
Describe
I hope
some
they've
of it.
been appreciative, and I
Yeah.
doubt that. I doubt it.
Tell who's appreciative.
Well, I know Paul is, because he always waves with everybody,
Yeah,
but the
so
others
John.
ignore you. Well, they're absolutely marvelous. I'm so proud, and I'm so proud of the Toronto teenagers as well. I think they behave themselves.
I'll take 2 large carrots then.
Eat better. Easier said than done, right? We all have an understanding about how we ought to eat, but the federal government put it in writing. And what's more, it's planning a complete revamp of the Canada Food Guide. But if you thought those 4 food groups were dead simple, think again.
We want them to be talking about more plant-based proteins. We want them to really go at the fact that juice is not an equivalent to whole food, whole fruits.
Earlier in the program, we told you 26,000 people have already weighed in on the overhaul, from activists to industry groups.
It has been politicized beyond belief because there's a lot at stake.
That's especially true for industries like meat and dairy, traditional sources of protein now facing stiff competition. And another industry fighting for its place in the new food guide, makers of fruit juice. Some of the world's biggest producers are lobbying Ottawa hard. But as David Common shows us, consumers need convincing too.
Hey Canada, wake up, today's on the cane day. Rich in vitamin C. 2 servings of real fruit inside.
No sugar do they add.
Because it's Canada's best. I'm aboard a thrilling airboat.
Aren't old ads the best?
Nothing's added to the natural goodness of real orange juice.
The pitch line, straightforward. Juice is healthy and good to drink many times a day.
Good morning. It's great to stay up late.
That idea squeezed through to policy too. Canada's Food Guide has long recommended juice, saying a half glass is the same as a fruit or a half a cup of veggies. Problem is, people aren't buying that anymore.
What we're seeing is that a significant share of Canadians already disassociate juice as having the same benefits as fruit, if you will.
Others have too. The Heart and Stroke Foundation says listing juice as a fruit serving in the Canada Food Guide is bananas.
It comes down to a few reasons, but number one, I would say, is sugar content and the concerns about sugar content. If you look over time, attitudes towards sugar have hardened.
Joel Gregoire does market research for Mintel. Even when the sugar in juice is natural, not added, he says for many Canadians, it's still a turnoff.
We ask consumers about what they're looking for in juice, what type of innovation they're interested in. Are they moderating their juice consumption? And we see that a significant portion of Canadians also say that they are drinking less juice than they used to.
Juice consumption dropped 15% in Canada between 2011 and 2017, a big shift in a $2 billion a year business. And some see a threat in the new Canada Food Guide expected out in 2019. Already, the feds say the proposed recommendations are for plain water as the beverage of choice to help reduce sugar's intake.
Canadians are slowly moving away from unhealthy choices when it comes to beverages.
If you think the food guide doesn't impact consumer habits, think again, says Sylvain Charlebois.
Of course, in schools, teachers use the food guide to teach students how to eat every single day.
Some of Canada's biggest juice makers are pushing back, represented by the Canadian Beverage Association and funded by the likes of Coca-Cola, which owns Minute Maid, Simply, and Five Alive, and Pepsi, which makes Tropicana, Dole, and Ocean Spray. According to an investigation by the Globe and Mail, the CBA has made its case with federal ministers and decision makers more than 50 times in person since October of 2017. And Lassonde, behind Allen's, Oasis, and Del Monte, warns that juice in Canada is under threat and that removing it from the food guide would create unintended consequences. The Canadian Juice Council told CBC News that Canadians are already not meeting minimum recommended intakes for fruits and vegetables. 100% juice, it says, can play a key role in helping to meet daily nutrient requirements.
It's hard to say whether it's a threat, but if I was in the juice industry, what I'd really be looking at is what do consumers really want and where are they at?
And that is a driving force at the Greenhouse Juice Company. And they're growing after finding a way to overcome the high sugar content of fruits like oranges and apples.
So this one is all fruit. It's orange, grapefruit, lemon, and some cayenne. But instead of having all orange, which would make it a very, very sweet juice, we've cut the sweetness of the orange with lemon and grapefruit. So you're getting less than a third of the sugar that you get in your standard glass of orange juice.
That's their citrusy option, but most of Greenhouse's juices actually go light on the fruit.
Our most popular juices, vegetables really form the core of the juice.
While others in the juice business worry about losing their status on the food guide, Greenhouse embraces the change.
We are so in favor of this update to the food guide, and we think that there is room for a more nuanced definition of juice.
And where small players like Greenhouse are trending is also where the bigger companies may soon follow, where some consumers are turning against sugar, natural or not, and looking for a way to stay relevant and wanted. David Common, CBC News, Toronto.
Now, a big question out of all of this, do Canadians actually know or care what's in that food guide? And then, ultimately, does it even affect what people eat? We asked Nick Purdon to find out.
Ah, yes, the Government of Canada. All the important documents that make us who we are were written in there. The Constitution, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Canada's Food Guide. That's the document that outlines what and exactly how much every Canadian should eat. Now, after 77 years in circulation, we're asking the question, in 2019, is the Canada Food Guide something Canadians really need? At a diner just a few blocks from Parliament Hill, Dr. Yanni Friedhoff says it sure is. He believes the Food Guide influences us whether we know it or not.
The Food Guide has a few different roles in Canada. So in our schools, in our hospitals, in publicly funded institutions, our arenas, our municipal buildings, the Food Guide dictates to some degree what's being served.
Dr. Friedhoff points out that Canada's Food Guide is taught to doctors, nurses, dietitians, and every single kid who goes to school.
It becomes almost the nutritional consciousness of the country that is disseminated unconsciously over time.
Excuse me? What was that?
And it becomes almost the nutritional consciousness of the country that is disseminated unconsciously over time.
That's pretty high praise for a 6-page pamphlet, even if it is in color. But surprise, surprise, not everyone sees the Food Guide that way. Meet Aaron Woodrick of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation.
Do you have a position on the Food Guide?
Well, I would question whether we need to spend money on this, right? We've only got so much money to go around. You want to spend it on the most important things. Is a government-specified food eating plan the best use of taxpayer money? Probably not. There used to be no other way to get this kind of information about nutrition and food. Now it's at your fingertips on your smartphone. So we're still doing something we started doing 50, 60 years ago, even though we don't really need to be doing it anymore.
If you heard it referred to as the nutritional consciousness of the country, what do you think of that?
I would say it's the subconsciousness. In other words, I don't think most Canadians even know what's in it. And I think that's probably the case for 99% of Canadians could not tell you what is in the Canada Food Guide.
Challenge accepted.
Do you know what it is?
Let's go find some regular Canadians and find out.
Do you guys know what Canada's Food Guide is?
No, we do not.
You don't know?
No.
Do you know what it is?
No. It's the suggested servings that you should eat of all the different categories of like dairy, meat, fruit, grain.
Do you follow it?
Not at all.
The Canada Food Guide, is that something that you follow?
No.
Have you ever?
No.
Never?
No.
Are you aware of it?
No.
Do you know what Canada's Food Guide is?
I don't know what it is.
You've never seen Canada's Food Guide?
I've seen it, but I've never paid any attention to it.
Canada's Food Guide. Do you know what that is?
Yeah.
Do you follow it?
No.
How come?
I'm on a seafood diet.
What does that mean?
I see food and I eat it.
I'm pretty sure that's the diet that most of us are on.
It's that consciousness.
Back at the diner, what does Dr. Friedhoff make of our pretty unscientific poll?
I think that many people will deny it has any influence or effect on them whatsoever. And I think that they are mistaken and well-intentioned, and it does in fact matter. You know, Health Canada likes to brag it's the second most requested document from the website behind tax returns.
So no matter what you think, the Food Guide will affect you.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement because it will influence our purchasing choices. It will influence sales in supermarkets, and it will influence the coverage of different nutritional subjects in the media.
If it really has that kind of influence, no wonder governments keep publishing it. But there's a deeper question here. What was it that Pierre Trudeau famously said?
There's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation.
Well, maybe we can rejig that just a little.
Is there a place for the state in the kitchens of the nation?
Not really. No, I think it's education, personal choices. I think it's a responsibility of parents to bring their children up right.
Now, if I'm there in your kitchen and I open your fridge, what do I see?
Oh, you'll see a lot of healthy stuff. My wife's a very good cook and even have kale.
You have kale?
Yeah, I hate kale.
Do you think the government belongs in the fridges of the nation?
I do. I do indeed. But only to give advice. Nothing beyond that.
Do you think the government belongs in your fridge?
Oh, yes. Yes, I'm all for the government being involved in the food guide.
Back at Parliament Hill, I have a sneaking suspicion I know what Aaron Woodrick's going to say.
I don't know that publishing a food guide is going to change people's eating habits. You look at, we've had the food guide for more than half a century, and obesity rates are way up, so it hasn't been working very well.
So what should the government do?
I think they should get rid of it.
Get rid of it after 77 years? Can we really do that?
Working.
Dr. Friedhoff warns that without the food guide, there would be nothing to protect us.
It is the responsibility of the government to do its best to provide us with guidance and support to make healthier choices easier. So I'd rather the government be in our fridges than the food industry, right? The food industry's sole job is profit. That's literally their job. And the largest profit drivers for the food industry are cheap ingredients like salt, sugar, and fat, none of which are useful to consume to great excess.
Sometime this year, Canada's new food guide will drop. And word is it will push us to eat more plant-based foods. Like kale. I mean, we know we should, but will we? Nick Purden, CBC News, Ottawa.
Okay, our series on Canada's food guide continues throughout the week, right here on The National and on all platforms. Tomorrow afternoon, I'll be joined by 3 doctors, all with very different perspectives on what should be in the guide, how we should use all that information, and what impact that has on the entire country. They'll be taking your questions on Facebook Live at 3:30 p.m. Eastern. I'm sure you got lots of questions, so join the conversation, facebook.com/The National.
Next on The National, Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe apologizes to Indigenous people who were gathered up in the 60s scoop.
I'm very happy. I'm very happy that I've heard the 2 words that I've asked to hear all along. I'm sorry.
More on what that meant for those survivors just ahead. But first, in case you missed it, a Canadian has become the first meme of 2019. There were a lot of stars on the Golden Globes red carpet, and behind seemingly every one of them was model Kelleth Cuthbert, usually looking enigmatically at the camera. The internet noticed. Then came the captions, the photoshopping, and hashtag Fiji Water Girl became an overnight sensation. The bottled water company and its blue-clad models have become a fixture at showbiz events for years, but at the Golden Globes, she took a proven marketing strategy and supercharged it with a sultry, humorous smile.
Just want to creep over, always make eye contact, keep it sultry. It's all about the looks, sultry looks. Oh, the blue steel.
Fiji Water has been under scrutiny in the past for its dealings with Fiji's military dictatorship and its environmental impact. This is bottled water, after all, taken from a local aquifer and shipped around the world. But with Cuthbert carrying their water, the company got a different kind of attention.
If you're holding something, want to keep it visible, you just have to look pleasant towards the camera. You know, give it some eyes.
Cuthbert was just doing her job and doing it well. But behind this meme, there's a brand with a motive.
The free trade talks are now in their final stages, and today's bargaining in Washington suggests there's still a lot of work to do before there's any deal. But while the debate continues over free trade with the United States, the fact is there really is no free trade within Canada itself. The provinces have set up rules that limit interprovincial trade. Those rules protect jobs, but they also cause a lot of problems. Our business specialist, Der Ho Yin, explains.
If you're like most Canadians, you probably think you can work wherever you like. You probably think that goods made in Canada can move freely within Canada. And you probably think you have the right to buy the cheapest products produced in Canada, no matter which province they come from.
Our Constitution explicitly provides that anything made or grown in any province shall be admitted free into each of the other provinces. That means no duties. But provincial governments have gotten around it in other ways by setting up interprovincial barriers to trade, barriers that don't involve duties.
We have regions in Canada, and in a way we're almost a set of 10 separate little countries.
Example, this small Quebec town put in new brick sidewalks and then had to tear them up. The reason? The bricks were made in Ontario. The Quebec Transport Ministry, which was paying for the work, insisted the bricks had to come from Quebec. Example, in farm products, many marketing boards favor producers in their own provinces. By the way, they hand out quotas for such products as chicken, eggs, and milk, even if it's cheaper to produce them out of province. Example, it's hard for doctors, lawyers, and many skilled tradespeople to move from one province to another. In every province, medical societies, law societies, and some labor unions put strict controls on who can work where. Even the movement of goods from province to province is an administrative nightmare. A truck needs a separate license from every province it travels through, even if it never stops there. And getting provincial licenses isn't all that easy.
The licensing is so stringent and so difficult to obtain that a carrier may not get it even if they pay exorbitant amounts of money to obtain it.
It's complicated, too, for companies that make wine, liquor, and beer. Most provinces tell breweries, if you want to sell your beer here, you have to make it here. To sell its product across the country, Labatt, for instance, has had to set up breweries in almost every province.
Bigger brewers, bigger businesses, bigger production units are somewhat more efficient than smaller ones. Having a lot of little ones makes you inherently less efficient than having a few big ones.
So Moosehead beer, only brewed in New Brunswick, isn't widely available in Canada, even though it's sold in all 50 American states. Some say, under the current system, the Canadian beer industry, like many others, would not survive if there was a free trade pact with the United States because of the barriers to trade within Canada.
The interprovincial barriers have to go. The two-price system for barley has to go. Some of the marketing boards, the liquor boards, have to drop their requirements for us to get everything approved. All those things have to be changed or we're not competitive with the competition that they now want us to face.
Clearly, barriers to trade within Canada do create inefficiencies and higher costs for consumers too, an estimated $1 billion a year, maybe more. Some regulations do create jobs in each province, but they can make industries uncompetitive. So many economists say, with or without free trade with the United States, the provinces have to start talking about ways to improve trade within our own country. Der Hoyen, CBC News, Toronto.
Canadian officials are now treating the disappearance of a Quebec woman in West Africa as a kidnapping. 34-year-old Edith Blay and her Italian travel companion were last heard from on December 15th in Burkina Faso. Her family have been unable to locate her. Canada has an active travel advisory for Burkina Faso to avoid non-essential travel due to the threat of terrorism.
As to that charge, how do you plead?
Guilty.
In the U.S., a Michigan man has pleaded guilty to killing 6 strangers and injuring 2 others. This happened nearly 3 years ago when the driver, Dalton, was an Uber driver. The shootings took place between passenger pickups. He made his pleas over his attorney's objections. They trigger a mandatory life sentence with no chance of parole. The 48-year-old father of 2 did not explain his motive for the shootings. A woman whose life sentence for murder sparked outrage in the United States has been granted clemency. Cyntoia Brown was just 16 years old when she killed a man who bought her for sex. She was then tried as an adult. Her case gained celebrity attention from Amy Schumer, Rihanna, and Kim Kardashian West. Today, the Tennessee government announced that Brown will be released in August.
What do you say to your accuser? Right.
And Kevin Spacey was in court today to face a charge of indecent assault. The actor pleading not guilty to accusations that he groped an 18-year-old busboy at a bar in 2016 after buying him drinks. This is the first criminal case brought against the 59-year-old following a string of sexual misconduct allegations. Spacey won't have to attend his next appearance. That is set for early March. And the Canadian band Walk Off the Earth have announced a memorial event for Mike Taylor, or Beard Guy as he was known to fans. Taylor was the keyboardist and vocalist in the Burlington-based group. He died in his sleep on December 29th. The free musical tribute happening on Sunday will feature performances from the Bare Naked Ladies, among others.
Saskatchewan's premier has formally apologized to the survivors of the 60s scoop. It saw 20,000 Indigenous children taken from their families and placed with non-Indigenous strangers. Parted from loved ones, stripped of their language, culture, and often abused. It continued from the 50s through to the 80s. Saskatchewan is the third province to acknowledge its failings. Premier Scott Moe's predecessor had promised an apology but never followed through. Today, Moe delivered what so many have been waiting to hear.
I stand before you today to apologize. To all of those who lost contact with their family, we are so sorry. There is nothing that we can offer that will fully restore what you have lost.
For many, those words are long overdue. For others, they ring a bit hollow. Bonnie Allen spoke to one survivor with mixed feelings.
60 Scoop survivor Rod Belanger chose to dance at the legislature to celebrate this as a moment of reconciliation, even though he says the apology itself means nothing to him.
There's a lot of things that are missing because of the apprehension, and I don't think an apology is ever going to fix that.
At age 3, Belanger was taken from his Indigenous mother and placed in a white foster home where he was physically abused.
I caught on real fast that I was different and that I was an Indian, even though I still didn't know what that really meant, but I had to protect myself lots.
By 12, he was shuffled into a group home, then lured into a street gang. Alcohol and drugs followed, and eventually jail.
It just got real dark real fast.
It was dancing that helped connect Belanger to his Indigenous culture. This past fall, he was part of a group of survivors that organized sharing circles to help shape the government's apology. But even the group was divided.
The board almost split up because of this. Half of us felt that they were going to get something out of the apology, and half of us felt that this is a bunch of bullshit. Sorry, the language.
The reaction is still mixed. As Premier Scott Moe danced a Métis jig to end the apology ceremony, survivors looked to the future.
I'm mentally drained, but I am very happy. I'm very happy that I've heard the two words that I've asked to hear all along. I'm sorry. Now the hard work begins.
I'm just hoping, and we're just praying that a lot of the things that he said come to light.
For Rod Belanger, that includes keeping today's Indigenous children out of care. In his apology, Premier Scott Moe said that is the government's goal. Bonnie Allen, CBC News, Regina.
And up next on The National, remembering Mr. Bike Man, the man whose yearly tradition put a smile on so many faces.
He was a special person, a true Renaissance man. He was a philanthropist. And he always had something special for everybody that he interacted with.
Canadians are famous for their use of A, and it turns out this little two-letter word predates our country's very confederation. But where did it come from, and why do we use it? The earliest reference that researchers have found in literature takes us back to an Irish play written in 1773. And then, with the influx of immigration, it was found here in a Thomas Chandler Halliburton book called The Clockmaker, written way back in 1836. That book has A sprinkled throughout the dialogue, indicating we've been using it for as long as Canadian English has been around. Skip forward to the 1970s, and Time magazine published an article all about A as a true Canadianism. But it was in the 80s that A became satire when CBC TV introduced us to a pair of beer-swilling brothers on SCTV.
I'm Bob McKenzie. This is my brother Doug. How's it going, eh?
Bob and Doug McKenzie's plaid-wearing, hockey-playing, A-saying persona created a stereotype that has been with us ever since.
Ted, this hydro bill is bigger than Louis Sir's biceps. What, you leave the carburetor on all night, eh?
I moved here from Canada and they think I'm slow, eh?
Now, this little word is what's called a confirmational, where you're tacking it onto the end of a sentence to confirm whether something is true. This is not an unusual thing in language. Linguists have found equivalents in East Asia, in Africa, and yes, even in the States. But in America, they say huh. And the constructs set up around huh are different compared to where we use a. Humans are hardwired to notice those subtle differences, which are called minimal pairs in linguistics. And that tension, that little disparity that Americans notice but can't quite put their finger on, that really draws an outsider's ear and has them make fun of us a little bit more.
Don't mean to take too much space up down here, eh? That's a good accent, and I do not apologize for it.
And while A is heard elsewhere, such as New Zealand and the little island of Guernsey, one thing that researchers suggest is totally unique to Canada is what's called the narrative A, which is used during storytelling. So I'd say, then I walk into the house, eh? And it's just filled with people, eh? And we're not really expecting a response there, it's just drawing the storyteller's audience in. Now, while young Canadians are largely exchanging A for right, as in, so then I walk into the house, right? And it's just filled with people, right? It's still serving the same purpose. Hey is also being used as an alternative because it's not quite as stigmatized. But research shows A is still heard right across the country, with particularly large dollops of the word thrown into Northern Ontario speech. Now, naysayers of A might say that these are just two little letters tacked on to buy time as you think of your next thought. But A does a lot more, turning a statement into a question. A one-way remark turns into an exchange. So there's a lot of humanity baked into A. A?
Okay. Wait. The car keys are in the house. I got this. What are you doing? What are you doing? Stop it!
You want to talk about it at all? No. Okay.
You're gonna have to get your stomach pumped to scratch your balls!
Sorry, what? Sorry, what now?
What are they talking about?
Tommy, even though you are my brother, we would all be better off if you were never born.
Yeah.
Well said, Lowly.
Hi, I'm Peter Mooney. The new season of Burden of Truth is coming soon.
Take care of yourself.
Burden of Truth begins Wednesday at 8 on CBC.
This man, Avi Morrow, wore many titles. He was an entrepreneur, a painter, a philanthropist, but hundreds of children in Montreal never knew his name. To him, he was simply Mr. Bike Man, donating close to 2,000 bikes over the last 3 decades. Now, he wanted his generosity to stay anonymous. Well, on Saturday, he died, and today the secret of his identity was revealed, and a grateful community gathered to remember what he gave them. That's our moment.
I had no idea that it was Avi, no. Well, I'm trying to put the pieces together and I'm wondering, gave him pleasure to think about these young kids being able to get exercise and mobility. I think it was a beautiful gesture.
He was soft-spoken, kind, generous beyond words, but please, I don't want any attention. Just keep it quiet. Here's the check.
He was a special person. A true Renaissance man. He was a philanthropist, and he always had something special for everybody that he interacted with.
He was very modest, especially I remember when he received the Order of Canada. He said, "I'm not going to wear that. I'm glad they gave it to me, but I'm not going to wear that."
We say he was a mensch, a true gentleman. That's what he was.
You know, I remember my time in Montreal as a young, eager reporter and covering more than a few of those annual events, the bike giveaways, where they give away dozens of bikes to deserving kids. And just as uplifting as the act of charity itself were all the stories of those kids who'd earned those bikes. You know, kids who did ordinary but great things at the same time. You know, they may have had the wherewithal to call 911 in a family emergency or just do something nice for their neighbor. But it was always such a warm event and an important one in that city.
Yeah, and I think a lot of them were nominated too, and the bikes came through Sun Youth, and apparently Avi Morrow told one of the directors at Sun Youth that he wanted to stay anonymous because the point of giving was from the unknown to the unknown, and that's where he got his pleasure.
And so apparently the story is that his family, when he was young, had a hard time affording a bike, which is what inspired him to give bikes. But the other thing is, what a perfect thing to give kids. And we heard one of the people mention it during the moment. It symbolizes youth, it symbolizes freedom, and in this case, generosity as well. That is the National for January the 7th. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.